On a limestone ridge in the hill country of southeastern Turkey, close to the city of Sanliurfa, there is a slab of stone still fused to the bedrock it was cut from. It runs nearly 7 meters end to end. By most estimates, it weighs somewhere north of 50 tons. Someone had begun shaping it into the same kind of towering, T-shaped pillar that stands by the dozen a short walk away, at a hill the modern world calls Göbekli Tepe. And then, partway down one edge, the carving simply stops. The tool marks end mid-stroke. The rest of the stone is still rough, still half buried in the ridge that made it. Nobody knows why the work stopped there. Nobody knows who put down their tools and walked away. For roughly 11,000 years, it has lain exactly where it was abandoned, larger than any pillar the builders of that hill ever actually managed to raise. This is a story about the people who quarried that stone. Their monument predates the first block laid at Giza by something close to 7,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000. It was raised, as far as the evidence can currently show, by people who had not yet planted a crop, fired a pot, or written down a single word. And at some point, after using what they built for centuries, those same people did something almost nobody expected to find at a site this old. They buried it. On purpose, with their own hands. For a long time, the working assumption in archaeology ran in one direction. Farming came first. Only once people settled in one place, grew their own food, and produced a surplus could they spare the labor to cut and raise multi-ton stone. Monuments were supposed to be the reward a society earned after it learned to feed itself. Göbekli Tepe does not follow that order, and the record for it is not thin. This part of the story sits in peer-reviewed excavation reports, not fringe blogs, so where the evidence is solid I will say so, and where we are still guessing, I will say that too. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Göbekli Tepe sits on the highest point of a limestone plateau, visible for a long way across the surrounding plain, which is likely no accident. A local survey team noted the mound back in the early 1960s and assumed the broken stone slabs poking through the soil were leftover grave markers from a medieval cemetery. Nobody dug. It took until the mid-1990s when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt walked the same hill and recognized the pattern for what it actually was, for serious excavation to begin. What his team found, and what has continued to come out of the ground every season since, is a series of large stone enclosures, roughly circular, each ringed by a set of the same T-shaped pillars as the unfinished one still sitting in the quarry. The pillars stand between 3 and 6 meters tall. At the center of each ring, 2 larger pillars face one another, and on several of them the stone is carved with long arms that bend at the elbow, hands with delicate fingers meeting at the front, and in a few cases, a belt with a buckle running around the pillar's narrow waist. These are not blank markers. Whoever raised them meant for the stone to represent something like a body, or a being with a body's shape, standing at the center of the circle it belonged to. Around them, carved in low relief across the surrounding pillars, are foxes, boars, cranes, snakes, scorpions, and vultures with wings spread wide. No inscriptions accompany any of it. Writing was still thousands of years away. The bone record adds a practical layer to the picture. Excavators have pulled enormous quantities of animal bone out of the fill around several enclosures, gazelle in particular, along with wild cattle and boar, in amounts that go well beyond what a small resident group would need for daily meals. The pattern reads more like large periodic feasts than routine eating, which fits an image of scattered hunting bands traveling in from a wide area, gathering at set times to work on the stone, share food, and then dispersing again. Some researchers who have tried to estimate the labor involved put the number of people needed to move and raise a single large pillar somewhere in the low hundreds, working in coordinated shifts with ropes, timber levers, and packed earth ramps, none of which survives archaeologically, but all of which can be reasonably inferred from the physics of the stone itself. Radiocarbon dating of organic material sealed inside the oldest enclosures made archaeologists reconsider assumptions they had held for decades. It places construction at roughly 9,500 years before the Common Era, which puts the beginning of the site at close to 11,500 years ago. In the layers belonging to that earliest phase, excavators have found no domesticated wheat, no domesticated barley, and no bones from animals that show the skeletal markers of domestication. The people who cut, carved, and raised these pillars were still hunting wild game and gathering wild grain the way their ancestors had for tens of thousands of years before them. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Cutting a 6-meter limestone pillar out of bedrock, moving it several hundred meters without wheels or draft animals, standing it upright, and doing that dozens of times over, is not a task one family manages in a spare afternoon. It requires many hands working together, fed and housed for as long as the project takes, coordinated by some kind of shared authority or shared belief strong enough to hold a large group to the same purpose. The older model assumed that level of organization could only exist after farming had already produced a food surplus to support it. Göbekli Tepe suggests the organization came first, built by mobile groups who had not yet settled down, and that the monument itself may have been part of what eventually pulled them toward settlement rather than the other way around. That reversal is not settled science. It is a genuine, ongoing argument inside the field, and archaeologists who have spent careers on the site still disagree about how much weight to put on it. The unfinished pillar in the quarry connects directly to this problem. Its dimensions alone tell you something about ambition. At close to 7 meters and an estimated 50 tons or more, it dwarfs every pillar that was actually completed and raised on the hill above it. Whoever started cutting it either planned an enclosure larger than any built before, or was testing how far the technique could be pushed. The tool marks along its finished edge match the technique visible on the completed pillars nearby, repeated pounding with harder stone to rough out the shape, followed by finer working to smooth the surface. What the unfinished pillar does not offer is an explanation for why the work simply ended. There is no sign of a fracture that would have ruined the stone. There is no sign of violence, no burned layer, nothing that points to a disaster interrupting the crew. The most honest answer archaeologists can give is that they do not know. Maybe the group ran out of a resource they needed. Maybe the design changed partway through. Maybe whoever was directing the effort died, or lost the authority to keep people working on something this large. Every one of those is a guess dressed up as a plausible guess, not a documented fact, and the site itself has not given up which one, if any, is correct. The two large central pillars in each enclosure raise a separate question that the evidence answers even less completely. Their arms, hands, and belts strongly suggest the stone was meant to stand in for a person, or something with a person's outline, but nothing carved into them tells us who or what that figure represented. Some archaeologists read the central pillars as stylized ancestors, watching over the group that raised them. Others read them as depictions of a supernatural figure, a shaman or a guardian tied to the animals surrounding it. A few have proposed the animal carvings themselves worked less like art and more like a kind of memory device, marking events, alliances, or warnings for people who had no writing to record them another way. Every one of these readings has serious researchers behind it, and none of them can currently be proven from the stone alone. What is documented? The pillars exist, they were carved with clear intention, and the central pair in each ring was treated differently from the others. What is theory? Everything about what those figures were understood to be by the people who carved them. The tools recovered from the working layers are, at least, less ambiguous. Flint blades, scrapers, and dolerite hammerstones turn up by the thousands across the site, along with polishing stones used to smooth the finished pillar surfaces. None of it is exotic. All of it is the kind of stone toolkit expected from a pre-pottery Neolithic hunting community anywhere in the region. There is no metal, no wheel, no pulley system recovered from the site, and nothing in the tool assemblage requires one. What made the difference was not technology beyond what the era offered. It was the number of people willing to show up, season after season, and the authority, whatever form it took, able to hold that many hands to one shared task for as long as it took to finish. None of that, on its own, would set Göbekli Tepe apart from other early ceremonial sites scattered across the ancient world. What does set it apart happened later, sometime in the centuries after the enclosures had already stood in use for generations. The people who built the rings did not simply abandon them to weather and time. They filled them in, Enclosure by enclosure, using rubble, broken flint tools, animal bone, and soil hauled in from elsewhere, they packed the space between the pillars solid, burying their own monument under a mound of debris tens of thousands of cubic meters in total. That is not erosion. It is not a roof collapsing after centuries of neglect. The fill was placed there, layer after layer, by people who understood exactly what they were covering up, because it was the thing they and their parents and grandparents had built with their own hands. A group willing to spend generations quarrying, carving, and raising stone on this scale chose, at some point, to spend just as much effort putting it back into the ground. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Why they did it is the part no one can answer with certainty. A handful of explanations circulate in the academic literature, and it is worth naming them honestly rather than picking the spookiest one and presenting it as settled. Some archaeologists point to a wider pattern across the early Neolithic Near East, where structures were periodically decommissioned, their central features deliberately broken or buried, as part of a ritual closing rather than an act of destruction. Under that reading, burial was not an ending so much as a formal way of retiring a space once its purpose had been fulfilled, freeing the ground, or the belief system attached to it, for whatever came next. Others point to a shift in how these communities organized themselves. As farming and permanent settlement genuinely did take hold across the wider region in the centuries after Göbekli Tepe's earliest phase, older gathering sites tied to a mobile, hunting way of life may have stopped serving any practical or spiritual purpose for people who now lived differently. Burying the hill, in that version, closes one way of life to make room for another. A smaller number of researchers have floated more dramatic explanations: environmental stress, conflict, even deliberate concealment from some outside threat, but these rest on considerably thinner evidence than the first two, and a careful telling of this story has to say so plainly, rather than let the more dramatic option carry more weight than it has earned. What all of the honest theories share is an admission that they are theories. The fill itself carries no explanation carved into it. It only carries proof that the choice to bury was deliberate, coordinated, and permanent. The scale of what remains undisturbed is, if anything, the more striking fact. Since the early 2000s, archaeologists working the site have used ground-penetrating radar and magnetic survey equipment to map what lies beneath the surface without digging it up. Those surveys indicate that the enclosures excavated so far, the ones photographed, published, and shown to visitors, represent a small fraction of what is actually there. Current estimates put the number of additional stone rings still sealed under the hill somewhere in the range of 15 to 20, most of them never touched by a trowel. At the current pace of careful, methodical excavation, it could take decades, possibly longer, before more than a handful of those are opened. Göbekli Tepe is also no longer considered an isolated site. Similar T-shaped pillars, similar animal carvings, and similar buried enclosures have since turned up at other hills across the same region of southeastern Turkey, among them a site called Karahan Tepe, roughly 35 kilometers away, where excavators have reported pillars carved with more distinctly human faces than anything found at Göbekli Tepe itself. Further surveys across the same limestone belt have turned up traces of comparable enclosures at Navali Kori, a site now underwater since a nearby dam project flooded the valley in the 1990s, and at several smaller mounds that have barely been tested. Each new site pushes the known footprint of this culture a little wider without bringing back a single written word to explain any of it. Taken together, these sites point to a broad, connected culture spread across an area of hundreds of square kilometers, sharing a set of architectural and symbolic practices, all of it built before agriculture had taken hold anywhere in the region. That culture left behind monuments, tools, and carved stone by the thousands. It left behind no writing, no name for itself, and as far as current evidence shows, no direct descendants that historians can trace with confidence into the civilizations that followed in Mesopotamia and Egypt thousands of years later. What connects them to later history is not bloodline or continuity, it is only the raw fact that they came first, and that they proved monumental construction did not require the things later civilizations assumed it required. Put the pieces next to each other, and the shape of the story becomes clear enough to state plainly. Long before Egypt existed as a civilization, before the first dynasty, before hieroglyphs, before the wheel reached this part of the world, a group of hunter-gatherers on a limestone ridge in what is now Turkey organized themselves well enough to quarry, carve, and raise stone pillars weighing many tons, arrange them into deliberate rings, carve them with figures whose meaning is still argued over today, use those rings for what appears to have been centuries, and then, on purpose, bury the whole achievement under their own hands. None of that requires an outside explanation. It does not require lost technology or a vanished super-civilization to make sense of it. It requires accepting that people without agriculture, without writing, and without metal tools were capable of exactly the kind of coordinated, large-scale effort that later cultures are usually given sole credit for inventing. That is the actual reversal at the center of this story, and it may be the more remarkable one, because it does not need anything invented to be true. It also reframes the question at the heart of this story. This was not a lost race that ruled over Egypt, or over anyone else. There is no evidence these people ever crossed paths with the civilizations that rose in the Nile Valley thousands of years after them. What they ruled, if the word even applies, was a stretch of hill country most of us could walk across in a single day, and a set of beliefs strong enough to move 50-ton stone for it. That smaller, stranger truth is arguably harder to look away from than the grander one would have been. What remains genuinely unresolved is not whether the monument existed. That question closed decades ago. What remains open is everything about the people who built it. What they called themselves, what language they spoke, what exactly they believed was watching them from the center of each stone ring, and why, after generations of building, they chose burial over abandonment. Most of the hill is still under the ground. Most of the rings the radar has found have never been opened to daylight, and every one of them is sitting exactly where it was left, sealed under soil that has not shifted in roughly 8,000 years. Every excavation season adds a little more to the record and closes almost none of the real questions. The stone remembers more than we have managed to read out of it so far, and for now, most of what it remembers is still buried beneath that desert ridge, waiting on a shovel that has not turned that particular patch of earth yet. One stone from the same hill did not make it into the story so far. Archaeologists working in Closure D labeled it Pillar 43, and people who have only seen photographs of it usually know it by a simpler name, the Vulture stone. Carved across its face is a vulture with one wing spread wide, a scorpion, several smaller birds, and near the top a headless human figure. Above one of the birds sits a small circular disc, cut with more care than the rest of the relief around it. In 2017, an engineer named Martin Sweatman published a paper arguing the arrangement works as a kind of star map, each animal standing in for a constellation, pointing to a date close to 10,900 years before the present, a window several researchers tie to a period of sudden global cooling. Specialists in Near Eastern archaeology were, and largely remain, unconvinced. Several have argued the reading imposes a modern astronomical grid onto carvings that may simply show animals the builders hunted or feared. No excavation report from the site itself endorses the star map reading. The stone stays where it was found, carved once, argued over ever since. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.